Scaphism, the most horrific punishment in history. You can taste the honey on your lips. Sweet, thick. It clogs your throat as they pour more down, forcing your head back, and for a moment, just a moment, you think maybe this is mercy. Maybe they're feeding you before the execution. Then you feel it smeared across your face, your hands, your feet, warm and sticky under the relentless sun. And that's when you hear it. The first fly, then another, then a sound like distant thunder that isn't thunder at all, but wings, thousands of them. And you realize with absolute horror that this isn't the beginning of your death. This is just day one. Before we go any deeper into what happened next, I need to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, this ancient, somehow finds its way to people across every continent, every time zone. Drop a comment. I'd love to see how far this reaches. This was Persia. The year was 401 BC, and the man trapped in those boats, drowning in honey and his own waste, slowly being consumed alive over 17 days, was named Mithridates. His crime wasn't murder. It wasn't theft or treason in any conventional sense. His crime was far simpler, far more dangerous. He told the truth when the king needed a lie. And for that, the Achaemenid Empire, the largest, most powerful dominion the world had ever seen, engineered a punishment so methodical, so precisely cruel, that even the Greeks who documented it struggled to find words. They called it Scaphism, from the Greek word for boat. But boats suggest voyage, escape, hope. These boats were coffins that refused to close, ovens that kept you alive, tombs where decomposition began while your heart still beat. Let's go back. Just a few months earlier, Mithridates was a soldier. Not a rebel, not a conspirator. A loyal Persian warrior serving in the army of King Artaxerxes II, the king of kings, the ruler whose word shaped reality itself across an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Mediterranean. But empires, no matter how vast, are always most vulnerable from within. And Artaxerxes had a problem. His younger brother Cyrus had raised an army, 10,000 Greek mercenaries among them, and marched straight for the throne. This wasn't just rebellion, this was fratricide dressed as destiny. The two armies met at Cunaxa, in the scorching plains of Mesopotamia, and the battle was chaos. Dust and blood and the screaming of horses. And somewhere in that chaos, Cyrus fell. Dead. The rebellion shattered like glass. But here's where it gets complicated. Here's where truth became more dangerous than any sword. Artaxerxes needed more than victory. He needed mythology. He needed every subject from Babylon to Sardis to believe that he, the rightful king, chosen by the gods, had personally struck down his treacherous brother. That's the story that went out. Official, absolute, unquestionable. The king's word was woven into the fabric of cosmic order itself, into Asha, the Zoroastrian principle that bound truth and righteousness and royal authority into one unbreakable thread. To challenge the king's word wasn't just political dissent, it was an assault on the universe. And then Mithridates opened his mouth. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was wine. Maybe he just didn't understand the stakes. But at a royal banquet, surrounded by nobles and generals, Mithridates made a claim. He had killed Cyrus. Not the king, him. He'd been there, in the crush of battle, and his spear had found the prince's neck. He described it. The angle. The blood. He wanted credit. Recognition. What he got instead was silence. The kind of silence that precedes annihilation. Because in Artaxerxes' court, this wasn't mere contradiction. This was cosmic vandalism. The king's narrative wasn't just propaganda, it was the official structure of reality. And Mithridates, with his clumsy boasting, had tried to rewrite it. The punishment couldn't be simple. It couldn't be quick. Death by beheading was for thieves, for common criminals. Mithridates had committed a crime against truth itself, against order, against the divine right that held an empire of millions together. His punishment had to reflect that. It had to be something worse than death. It had to be a warning that would echo across generations, carried in whispers and nightmares, ensuring that no one would ever dare challenge the king's word again. So they built the boats. Not quickly, not in rage. This was methodical. 2 identical wooden troughs, carved and smoothed, each shaped to hold half a human body. Mithridates was laid in the lower one, flat on his back. Then the top one was lowered, fitted over him like a lid, sealed tight around his torso. His head protruded through a hole, his hands, his feet. Everything else, his chest, his stomach, his limbs, was trapped inside this wooden prison, immobilized, compressed. The boats were clamped together, bound with rope. He couldn't move, couldn't shift position, couldn't scratch an itch or adjust his weight. The wood pressed against his skin, his ribs, restricting circulation even before the real horror began. And then they fed him. Forced feeding. That's what the sources call it, but those words don't capture the violence of it. Guards pried open his mouth, using tools if necessary, sharp implements that cut his lips and gums, and poured milk down his throat. Honey. Rich, heavy, more than any stomach could hold. If he gagged, they waited, then poured more. If he refused, they hurt him until he complied. This wasn't sustenance. This was biological weaponization, because every drop he consumed meant his body kept processing, kept producing waste, urine, feces, all of it trapped inside those sealed wooden boats with him, pooling, fermenting in the heat. He was creating the medium for his own decomposition. But the milk and honey served another purpose. Once they'd forced enough down his throat, they smeared it everywhere the sun could reach. Thick layers across his face, matted into his hair, covering his hands and feet like gloves. And here's the genius of it, the calculated brilliance that makes your skin crawl. Honey mixed with sweat becomes adhesive. It traps heat. And in the Mesopotamian summer, under a sun that turned the air itself into a furnace, that sweet coating became an invitation. Within minutes, the flies arrived. At first, just a few, curious, circling, then dozens, then hundreds. The buzzing grew into a roar, a living sound that surrounded Mithridates' head like a halo of horror. They landed on his face, his eyes, his lips still wet with honey. They crawled into his ears, his nostrils, and they laid eggs. Thousands of eggs, nestled into the sticky sweetness, into the folds of his skin, into any wound or opening they could find. The warmth, the moisture, the sugar, it was a perfect incubator. Within a day, those eggs hatched. Maggots, white and writhing, feeding on the honey first, then burrowing into his flesh, eating him alive while his heart still pumped blood to feed them. Day 2, maybe day 3. The pain became total, external and internal, merging into one continuous scream that tore his throat raw. Outside, the sun had blistered his face into something unrecognizable, skin peeling in sheets, eyes swollen nearly shut, lips cracked and bleeding. The maggots multiplied exponentially, a churning mass in his hair, around his ears, tunneling into the soft tissues of his face. He couldn't shake them off, couldn't brush them away. He could only feel them, every horrible second eating deeper. But inside the boats, something even worse was happening. The waste he'd been producing, urine, feces, sweat, mixed with the milk and honey they kept forcing into him, had created a toxic soup. In the trapped heat, bacteria exploded. The smell alone would have been unbearable, but Mithridates couldn't escape it. He was breathing it, drowning in it. His skin, where it touched this fermenting sludge, began to break down. Chemical burns, raw and weeping, and through every microscopic opening, every insect bite, every crack in his skin, those bacteria flooded into his bloodstream. Sepsis. Systemic poisoning. His own body turning against him, one cell at a time. The guards came twice a day, not to help, to maintain. They checked the boats, ensuring the seal held. They forced more milk, more honey down his throat, keeping his organs functioning, keeping death at bay. Because the sentence was 17 days. Not 16, not 18, 17. And their job was to ensure Mithridates survived every single one. If his fever spiked too high, if he seemed close to the mercy of unconsciousness, they'd intervene. A splash of water on his face. A brief moment of shade. Just enough to pull him back from the edge to keep him trapped in the awful clarity of his suffering. There are records, fragmentary, disturbing, suggesting that physicians were sometimes consulted. Healers who understood the body's limits, who knew exactly how much trauma a human being could endure before systems shut down. They weren't there to ease pain. They were there to prolong it, to advise on feeding schedules that would maintain metabolism without providing strength, to suggest minor adjustments in the boat's positioning that would balance sun exposure with the need to prevent fatal heat stroke too early. Medical knowledge weaponized, turned into an instrument of maximized suffering. And it was public. That's crucial to understand. These boats weren't hidden in some dungeon. They were placed in the center of town, in markets, in places where people gathered. Citizens walked past. Merchants, families, children. They could smell the decay from blocks away. They could hear Mithridates' screams, when he still had the strength to scream, dissolving into moans, then whimpers, then just the wet sound of breathing through a throat half closed with infection. People commented on his deterioration like they were discussing the weather. Look how his face has blackened. The maggots have reached his scalp now. I heard they fed him this morning. He's still alive. This was theater. Macabre, calculated theater. Every passerby received the same message, written in rotting flesh. This is what happens when you contradict the king. This is what happens when you threaten the cosmic order. This is what truth costs when it collides with power. By day 7, Mithridates was barely human. The insects had consumed so much of his face that bone showed through in places. His hands, exposed and immobile, had swollen into unrecognizable clubs, blackened with gangrene. The smell, witnesses described it as something that clung to clothes, to skin, that infiltrated dreams and turned stomachs hours after leaving. And yet he lived, fed, maintained, trapped in a body that had become a horror, a consciousness imprisoned in its own dissolution. Rats came around day 9 or 10, drawn by the smell. They gnawed at his feet, at his fingers, adding fresh wounds, fresh screams to the symphony of agony. The guards didn't stop them. This, too, was part of the design. Every additional torment, every new violation of his body, served the message. There was no mercy here. No limit to the suffering power could inflict when properly motivated. 17 days. The sources emphasize this number with almost religious precision. Not because Mithridates finally died on day 17, though he did, his body surrendering at last to septic shock, organ failure, the simple impossibility of surviving his own decomposition. But because 17 days was the sentence. Calculated, prescribed, carried out exactly as ordered. A demonstration of state power so absolute it could orchestrate death itself, could keep a man alive in hell through sheer administrative will. When it was finally over, when the guards confirmed that Mithridates' chest had stopped rising, they didn't remove the boats immediately. His body was left for another day, maybe 2, continuing to rot, continuing to teach. Then, when the lesson was judged complete, they burned what remained. No burial, no grave, no memorial. His name was struck from military records. His family forbidden to mourn publicly. Erasure. Total, except for the one thing the Empire wanted remembered. The terror. And it worked. For decades afterward, Scaphism lived in Persian consciousness like a demon in a cage. Governors weighing rebellion thought of the boats. Soldiers considering desertion remembered the flies. The punishment was used sparingly. It was too expensive, too labor-intensive to deploy casually. But that rarity made it more powerful. It hung over the empire like an unspoken threat, a final card the king could play against anyone who dared challenge not just his rule, but his reality. Here's what haunts me most about Mithridates' story. He was probably telling the truth. Most historians who've studied the Battle of Cunaxa think it entirely plausible that a common soldier, in the chaos of combat, landed the killing blow on Cyrus. Artaxerxes' claim was almost certainly the lie, which means Mithridates died for 17 days, consumed alive, erased from existence, not for lying, but for truth, for having the catastrophically bad judgment to speak reality when mythology was required. The boats are gone now. The Achaemenid Empire is dust. Artaxerxes' name survives only in history books. His cosmic authority evaporated 2 millennia ago. But the logic of Scaphism, make an example of one to terrify millions, transform a human being into a message, demonstrate that challenging authority carries a price worse than death, that logic hasn't disappeared. It simply changes form, wears different clothes, uses new tools. The calculated cruelty that can make 17 days feel like eternity still finds administrators and apologists who will design procedures to produce the same effect without wood or rope. And yet the lesson persists, not as wood and honey but as policy, rumor, spectacle. We invent vessels for the old purpose, tribunals that silence testimony, public shaming amplified by networks that never forget, economic punishments that strip survivors of dignity. The spectacle adapts to technology. Ink replaces honey, algorithms replace flies, but the effect remains. Compress an individual into a cautionary symbol. Power refashions cruelty until it seems administrative and therefore inevitable. Consider the machinery behind these acts. Committees that decide whose pain counts, experts who refine methods until they are efficient but not fatal, officials who time the punishment so it remains legible to observers. It's not chaos, it's choreography. Bureaucracy makes cruelty repeatable and predictable. It converts impulse into procedure and then elevates procedure into doctrine. Memory becomes a weapon, too. Erasure complements spectacle. Names are scrubbed, archives redacted, photographs cropped until the face is gone. Absence becomes a message. Silence circulates like a contagion. Families learn to grieve quietly because public mourning invites further penalty. The record is rewritten so inconvenient truths sink beneath footnotes or vanish entirely. Still, beneath mechanisms and metaphors, the human cost resists abstraction. The person punished is not merely a symbol, but a body with debts, loves, and private rhythms. Their punishment reshapes a community's sense of what may be said, who can be trusted, how fear flavors daily choices. The price is paid not only by the punished but by those who silence themselves to survive. There is another consequence: the corrosion of trust. When authority demands myth and enforces it, the foundations of mutual belief erode. Citizens learn to measure risk not in ideals but in survival calculus. They prefer small lies that keep them fed, half-truths that permit warmth at home. The civic imagination atrophies. When truth later returns, the rupture is sharper because doubt has been rehearsed. Mithridates' agony was particular, but its lesson is universal. The boats may have rotted, but the design survives in subtler forms. If we want to dismantle that design, we must choose discomfort over comfort, truth over tidy stories, and the slow work of protecting voices that unsettle power. Otherwise, the buzzing continues, patient as ever. We have to tell stories that refuse neat endings, to teach children that courage has costs, but silence costs more, and to build institutions that reward testimony instead of punishing the teller and actively